So how can we now use this animation controller? Well, I mentioned that behind the scenes it would update the state and kind of re-execute the build method therefore. Now, technically that's not entirely correct though, because if it would do that, it would mean that everything in the build method is rebuilt and re-evaluated 60 times per second if you have a frame rate of 60 frames. And whilst you want to do that for the things you're animating, you might not want to do that for all the other things that might be on the screen. For this screen here, it actually doesn't matter, because here I do only return this grid view, which I do want to animate. There is nothing else here, but for other screens it might matter. So therefore, animated controller does actually not call build multiple times, but instead you can think of it as a timer or an interval running behind the scenes to which you can listen to then manually update parts of the UI. And you can listen and update parts of the UI by using another widget provided by Flutter, the AnimatedBuilder widget. This AnimatedBuilder widget wants an animation and a builder. Now, the animation is a listenable object, and as it turns out, our animation controller is such a listenable object. So we can pass our animation controller as a value for animation to AnimatedBuilder. And behind the scenes, this will basically tell AnimatedBuilder when it should call this builder function here. Because this function which we pass to builder, this function here, will then be executed for every tick of our animation. So for example, 60 times per second. And then inside of this function, you can update a widget's padding or margin or whichever value you want to animate. So for example, here I'll take my grid view like this and cut it and use that as a value for this function here. So as a return value returned by this function. Now in this function, you also get some arguments. You get a context and a widget. Now the context is something we know. The widget we get here is an extra widget which we could add here on Animation Builder. We could add an extra child parameter here to set any widgets that maybe should be output as part of the animated content, but that should not be animated themselves. And this would allow you to improve the performance of an animation by making sure that not all the items that are part of the animated item are rebuilt and re-evaluated as long as the animation is running. And indeed, this is a feature which we can use here to actually set our grid view here as a child by cutting it again and setting it as a child. And by then adding a, let's say, padding widget here, which is then the actual widget that will be animated, which child is set to this child, which is the grid view. And therefore the grid view would technically be displayed inside of the padding, but it would not be rebuilt and re-evaluated 60 times per second. Only the padding widget would be rebuilt and re-evaluated that often. And from a performance perspective, that's of course preferable to re-executing everything that often. Now the padding widget also needs a padding value, and here I now want to set a value that's dynamically animated. And for this we can of course again use edge insets, but now here I'll use edge insets only to set the padding to the top, and this padding value should now be set dynamically. It should be set dynamically based on these bound values between which I'm animating. And the animation controller will start at a value of 0 and end after 300 milliseconds at a value of 1. Therefore, to animate my padding here, my top padding, I could set this equal to animation controller dot value, which gives me access to the current value, which will be between 0 and 1 as you learned, times 100, for example. Now we would animate up to a padding of 100, because initially animation controller value is 0, and 0 times 100 is 0. But at the end, after 300 milliseconds, we would have a value of 1 here, and therefore the padding would be 1. Now, if I do that and save everything, we can therefore see, if I go to favorites and back, nothing happens. And the reason for that is that indeed, out of the box, just by adding such an animation controller, the animation will not be played. To play it, you have to explicitly start it. And we can do this here in init state right after creating it. For this, you can target the animation controller again. And then here you got various controls. For example, you can stop it with stop if you would want to pause it whilst it's playing. For example, because a user tapped some widget or anything like this. And you can also start it by calling forward. This will start the animation and play it to its end unless you stop it in between. You could also use repeat instead of forward so that it would repeat the animation and always restart it once it's done. But here I'll go for forward. And with that, if you save this and then restart this, you will see that indeed if I go to favorites and back, this animation plays and it slides down these items. But wait a second, slide down? I wanted to slide them up. Well, we simply have to adjust our logic down there in the AnimatedBuilder. Currently, I'm animating from 0 to 100 here with this logic. To slide my items down, we should change this logic and, for example, set the padding to the top to 100 minus animation controller value times 100. This will initially be 0 and therefore will start at a padding to the top of 100. And by the end of the animation controller value will be 1, so this here will be 100, and 100 minus 100 will be 0, so therefore at the end of the animation, the padding to the top will be 0. And with that, it should indeed slide up. So if we save this, now this looks better, and now I got this animation as I switch to this screen. By the way, not if I come from the filters screen, because here this categories screen was never removed from the stack of screens. That's different with favorites, and the animation of course only restarts if the widget is re-added to the screen, because we started in init state, and init state is only executed when the widget is created. When we move to the filters screen, the categories screen is still on the stack and it's not recreated if we come back to it. It's just shown again. That's why we don't get the animation here, but why we do get it if we, for example, come back from the favorites screen. So that's how you can add explicit animations. By adding such an animation controller, configuring it, starting the animation, and then also controlling what should be animated, for example, the padding. And here, as mentioned, we're also using the performance optimization of putting the content that actually should only be part of the animation, but which should not be rebuilt because its values don't change, by putting that content into the separate child here so that it's included in the animated content but not rebuilt, which helps us with improving the application's performance.